I'm here to tell you a little bit about my new book, The Last Gasp, The Rise and Fall of the American Gas Chamber. I've also co-directed a companion documentary film based on a tiny piece of the book, which was commissioned by French and German TV. Hopefully, we will eventually get out an English version, which I'd especially like to see because I don't speak German and I don't speak French. The book, however, is a work of investigative history, and it exposes the sinister career of a now extinct execution method from America's closet of horrors. But there's more to the story than simple capital punishment, because it also gets into a number of other matters, including the eugenics movement, the impact of chemical warfare in the First World War, the emergence of modern chemical pesticides, and of course, one of the darkest episodes known to humankind, the Holocaust. Because the gas chamber was implicated in or was a byproduct of each of those phenomena. In the book, I explain how fiscal motives and other primal forces having nothing to do with crime shape the development of criminal punishments in modern society. But that discussion is too labyrinthine to replicate here. The story of the rise and fall of the American gas chamber involves a full cast of characters. Some were well-known historical personages and companies, but nearly all of the 594 convicts, mostly convicted murderers, rapists, and burglars, who were put to death in American gas chambers, and the persons attending their demise, remain largely forgotten figures, overshadowed by something much larger. Not all of them were innocent, that's for sure, but not all of them were guilty either. I'm sure that some of us here tonight would question whether any of them should have ever been executed by the state by any method. For those of you who still believe in capital punishment, maybe my work can help you see this issue in a slightly different light. Tonight's the first time that I've spoken to a live audience about this book. The death penalty is not a pleasant subject for anybody to deal with. Many people simply don't wish to give it much thought. And it's especially difficult to discuss America's death penalty in relation to the Nazi gas chambers, which occupy such a unique place in history. Nevertheless, I believe that people from every country need to come to terms with the issue of capital punishment. The burden weighs especially heavy on us Americans, since we are among the world's leaders in executions, one of the few Western nations that still uses the death penalty. Americans tend to keep their head in the sand when it comes to facing up to our huge punishment complex. But people in other nations have long been hip to our hang 'em high and lock up the key, throw away the key tendencies. America has pioneered a number of execution forms such as lynching, the electric chair, and lethal gas. But our contribution to the latter has been surprisingly overlooked until now. This book is the first in-depth work to connect the experience of the American gas chambers with the use of the gas chambers in the Holocaust. And it turns out there are a lot of dots to connect. Before I get into that, it's worth noting that public opinion and/or official policy regarding capital punishment can change pretty fast. Today, we're accustomed to seeing polls that place public support for the death penalty at more than 60%. But that was not the case in the late 1960s, when the majority of Americans said they opposed capital punishment. In fact, from the late 1960s to the late 70s, there were no executions in this country. Back then, the U.S. Supreme Court seemed to be on the verge of declaring an end to the practice, and it appeared that capital punishment would go the way of racially segregated lunch counters or other bygone relics. But that did not happen. Because about the time of Roe v. Wade, the right unleashed a backlash demanding the return of executions, and they brought back the ancient practice, masked in a more contemporary medical garb. And Ronald Reagan played a role in that. Since then, the U.S. has put to death more than 1,200 persons, most of them in the former Confederate states, which maybe is why they call them the red states. A similar cyclic phenomenon occurred in Germany. We remember that nation for the millions of prisoners it executed from 1939 to 1945. But consider that immediately before that, under the Weimar Republic, capital punishment had been virtually eliminated there. Germany then had been known as an anti-death penalty nation compared to the United States. And since the aftermath of World War II, Germany has repudiated executions once again. In 1949, capital punishment was banned under the West German Constitution, and East Germany abolished it in 1987. This raises an important point, because before we Americans assume that what the Germans did in the Holocaust was purely and demonically something that only Germans could commit, we need to honestly confront the historical record. So apropos of tonight's topic, let's recall for just a moment what was done to the Indians. The system of black slavery, the photographs of emaciated survivors of Andersonville concentration camp in the Civil War, the long and twisted tradition of lynching, the KKK and Jim Crow laws enforcing racial segregation, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's infamous opinion upholding involuntary sterilization in Buck versus Bell. All of these were, incidentally, American acts that Hitler studied and later copied right down to the boxcars carrying the tribe off to their doom. And let's not forget that from the 1920s onward, some Americans tried like hell to institute fascism here. We had them in the New York State legislature. We had them in Madison Square Garden. We had them in Long Island summer camps and upstate parades down Main Street. It's scary today to listen to the scratchy old pro-Nazi radio speeches of Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, and their ilk. Their rousing voices and the crowd's roar conjure up visions of what might have happened here if some people had had their way, or if some events had taken a slightly different turn. It must have been even scarier for people of the despised classes who were trying to survive those depressing times, not knowing what the future would hold for them, for this country, for democracy. Lindbergh was among those insisting that democracy was dead and fascism was, quote, the wave of the future, end quote. And a lot of people, particularly Republicans and Southern Democrats, agreed with him. Sinclair Lewis's chilling, semi-satiric novel, It Can't Happen Here, about a fascist takeover in the United States, was published in 1935. In it, Lewis foresees a folksy, populist politician who knows how to exploit the voters' discontent, one who rakes in piles of cash from big corporations to stoke the fires of religious zealots and crackpots, an attractive demagogue who can overpower the wishy-washy liberal opposition well enough to get elected as president of the United States, and who then seizes control of the news media, Congress, and the Supreme Court to become America's fascist dictator. Lewis's dystopian tale came out 75 years ago, but it resonates today, all the more as we approach the election of 2012. Lindbergh's science mentor was Dr. Alexis Carrel of New York's Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research University in New York, a Nobel Prize-winning pioneer in wound treatment and organ transplantation, who was also a fervent eugenicist and one of the world's most esteemed intellects. The same year that Lewis's book came out, Carrel published the year's big international bestseller entitled Man the Unknown, in which he presented his vision of, quote, a hereditary biological aristocracy, end quote, modeled on principles that were much like Hitler's. One passage contained this statement: those who have murdered, robbed while armed with automatic pistol or machine gun, kidnapped children, despoiled the poor of their savings, or misled the public in important matters should be humanely and economically disposed of in small euthanasia institutions that are supplied with proper gases. And nobody spoke out against him. In fact, that kind of talk had become quite common in polite society in Germany, in France, in England, even in the United States, and especially among the eugenicists and the racial supremacists. Within a few years, such thinking would start to become more than just words. Many scholarly works about the Holocaust say that the gas chamber was a unique invention of Nazi Germany. But that's simply not the case. In fact, the execution gas chamber was born here in the United States, first proposed for our own state of New York in 1888. Around the time of World War I, its development was encouraged by the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service and the immensely powerful chemical industry. It was first enacted in 1921 under the Nevada Humane Execution Law, and it was first carried out in Carson City, Nevada in 1924. The ravages of chemical warfare in the First World War had made the use of poison gas very unpopular. Tens of thousands of victims and survivors could attest to its horrific effects. My own great uncle suffered from it. Baseball great Christy Matheson died from it. One thing I discovered in researching this book was the extent to which World War I had increasingly become the chemists' war, with each side competing to see who could devise the most hideous new poisons. The war was ultimately decided by the involvement of the U.S., not so much for its troops as for its extraordinary chemical warfare production. An early Manhattan Project of sorts, like the one that would later build the atomic bomb, was the greatest military, industrial, scientific collaboration in world history to that point. And had the war continued into 1919, American and British forces planned massive aerial and artillery poison gas attacks on Germany, and their stated goal was to, quote, exterminate Berlin, end quote, to kill every civilian they could. That was 25 years before Hiroshima. No wonder that the Kaiser surrendered.